Welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations with me, Heman, where we do not just talk, we unpack, unlearn, and unearth the truths that system tries so hard to bury. Now, today's guest is someone I have been waiting to speak with for a very long time, honestly, and you will see why in just a moment. She is someone who is bold, brilliant, of course, unapologetically anti-caste, a writer, activist, and a grant maker who has been shaking up spaces from rural India to New York City, born into a legacy of resistance. With a freedom fighter grandmother and activist parents, she continued that fire on a global stage. Whether it is a police brutality in the USA or the caste violence big in home South Asia, Prachi Patankar is here, and trust me, she is not holding back. From fundraising feminist movements to pushing philanthropy to de-Brahminize itself, from writing pieces for the precise through privilege to championing digital Dalit resistance. Prachi is a proof that intersectional feminism is not just a theory but a bulletproof strategy. So, buckle up for this conversation. We're going to talk about caste, courage, and building power from grassroots to the global. So, without any further ado, let's dive into our conversation. Prachi, let's start with a basic. I would love to know if you would take us back to your roots in a rural Maharashtra. I mean, going through your profile and a few podcasts and interviews, I came to know that your grandmother was a freedom fighter and your parents deep in anti-caste and a feminist movement. So, what's that one memory from your childhood that lit the spark for your activism, and how does it still drive you today?
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Heman, for inviting me and for SARIM to give this platform. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say what is that one moment or one story. My grandparents were both my dad's parents. They were freedom fighters in the British anti-British occupation movement, independence movement for India, and they were part of something called the parallel government, which is a Prati Sarkar is what it was called. So part of the freedom movement, there were different tendencies and different ways that people resisted, and of course, the known one is the Congress. But there were many ways that people participated in the freedom movement and coming together to resist what they knew was a foreign occupation of the country and in the region. My grandparents were part of this parallel government, which was looking at the system in the U.S. In India, and knowing that even opposing British occupation was not enough, that they wanted to create a just society and a society without the exploitation, discrimination with caste there in the country for thousands of years. That British are a newer, important force that needs to be, but that's not the only status in South Asia. That caste is a big component and patriarchy are big parts of our society. And so parallel government had that vision of creating alternative forms of government now and then, so that when the British did leave, that they would have a system and a way to be looking at a way to create a system and a governance that's equity, that anti-caste, etc. And so that's what they were part of. And my grandfather was killed soon after independence. My dad was only 2.5 years old, but my grandmother raised me as part of women's movement and freedom movement. As I was growing up, she was part of the women's movement and a general anti-caste movement as well. So I kind of came up around that movement in Maharashtra, where people were resisting kind of taking over and exploitation around water rights and farmers' rights, especially in rural India, and women's rights were all of those issues. And so I was kind of, when you talk about intersectionality, all of those kind of issues were part of grew up and I would say what and how I think about activism.
That is, I mean, powerful, Prachi. Your roots clearly shaped your fire. And speaking of that fire, how did it play out when you took, I mean, those values to the streets of New York City, where you have been fighting against war, police brutality, and racism, while tying it back to the caste operation back in South Asia? Can you share a movement from one of those protests or campaigns that hit you hard? What did it teach you about connecting global struggles for our South Asian communities?
Mm. Yeah, for me, because I knew that way that racism and race is a big part of the way that in intersectional ways that oppression and exploitation exists. I grew up with the idea and understanding that's a real understanding that caste is component of every part of what exploitation and is a system. Caste system is part of all the exploitations, and if we need to understand how to get rid of and challenge those exploitations, that we need to understand how caste exploitation works. So because I knew that when I came into when I moved to the U.S., I understood how anti-Black racism and race, and when it connects to anti-Black racism, played out. And so when I came to New York City, it was clear in terms of that anti-Black racism how especially Black communities were treated in terms of economic opportunities, who did what kind of work in the United States in terms of jobs, and what kind of jobs people held, how exploitation of Black communities took place, and in terms of the violence to ensure that racism and that systemic racism continued. Police brutality is a big part of that, and so you see it on the streets, you see it play out, you see it through the examples that were taking place in New York, especially where police brutality is against Black people is at its strongest in terms of in the urban area. And so I could see the parallels because of the caste system, and I wanted to be part of a movement that opposes police brutality and racism. And soon, even around that time, U.S. had it was post 9/11, and U.S. has been thinking and preparing for a war in Iraq, or was in a war against Iraq, had started occupation in Iraq, had gone to war in Afghanistan, and so the movements and the communities that I was working with knew that the war, just like MLK knew, Martin Luther King knew that the racism at home is connected to the occupation and imperialism abroad, and those two issues are interlinked. I knew that from my mother, who in the 60s was part of the anti-war movement against Vietnam, the war in Vietnam. And that was also connected to the anti-racism movement in the 60s as well. And so that all of that was similarly playing out in the 2000s in New York when I was kind of participating in movements there. And police brutality and racism and anti-war were all connected. And as anti-war movements were taking place, and as war was increasing in Iraq and by the U.S. government, there was also repression of Muslim South Asian immigrant communities. There was also brutality and violence and racism felt by, or Islamophobia felt by, Muslim South Asian Arab communities in New York. And so we saw that connection that, that U.S. government, while it was doing imperialism and war abroad, that they needed to show that there was an enemy within, and Muslims and South Asians were that enemy. And so we were really connecting the anti-police brutality and racism movement to the anti-war movement and anti-repression movement, that the repression that was felt by Muslim, Arab, and South Asian immigrants at the time.
That is, quite interesting, Prachi, and it really shows how caste and race connects across borders. When we talk about the caste, we can also highlight about the role of Hindutva. For our audience, especially for younger folks tuning from South Asia or the diaspora, can you break down what Hindutva is and how it fuels caste oppression? And maybe share a story of someone you have made who is fighting this on ground.
Yeah, I mean, as people may know, Hindutva is it's in essence the Hindutva, it's essence of Hinduism is what people who believe in Hindutva think, that they are going back to the core of what they believe is Hinduism. And Hinduism obviously is a created religion, and Brahmanism is where it came from. And so there are many spiritual practices in India, and Hinduism was created to consolidate all of those religions and appropriating all of those spiritualities together, really at the core, supporting the theory of Brahmanism, which means that is caste supremacy. So when Hindutva is considered, a lot of Hindutva and Hindu supremacists believe that India is primarily a quote unquote Hindu nation. So even within that, Hindu, which is dominant caste Hindus, a nation that only belongs to those, and everybody else who is not Hindu, so called, or upper caste and dominant caste Hindu, are second class citizens. And so they wanted to, they still want and have created a movement that believes in making sure that India can become that quote unquote Hindu nation. And so that kind of ideology lives in the United States as well. And like I've said, at the very core of Hindutva is caste supremacy, that you cannot divorce the idea of Hindutva from the idea of caste supremacy, because Hindutva really corely believes in the very notion of Brahmanism. And so that is very important to understand, that caste suppression and caste supremacy are very much connected to the Hindu supremacist ideology, whether it's in India or it's other parts of the world as well. And we're seeing that play out in the United States. And this is where, in some ways, it's clearest, because when you have caste equity movements or anti-caste movements in the United States that are realizing and know that caste discrimination exists in the United States as well. When Dalit communities or Dalit American or Dalit immigrants to the United States are sensing and feeling and the exploitation and discrimination in workplaces in the United States, and they're opposing that to fight for laws that can protect people from caste discrimination in workplaces, the first people and the first movements and organizations that come to oppose that are Hindutva movements, are Hindu supremacist movements. And so if there was any doubt why Hindutva and caste supremacy is connected, you just have to look at those examples of who's the first organizations and what are the first ideologies that oppose the movements to fight for protecting from caste discrimination. Protecting from caste discrimination is seen by Hindu supremacists as an attack on them at the core, at the very core. And so that's very important for us to understand, and its role in perpetuating and the caste, not only perpetuating caste oppression, but keeping caste system alive and intact is what their goal also is.
And yeah, of course, I mean that is really an eye-opening, and Hindutva's impact is so real, and you have explained it so smoothly to understand. You are funding feminist movements led by caste oppressed and indigenous women in South and Southeast Asia. What's one project that got you super excited right now, and how is it changing lives for women who has been pushed to the margins?
Much of what I do in my job and what I have also talked about in general in the work, it's separate. So at the foundation, of course, I'm trying to bring the work of anti-caste movements, movements led by caste oppressed communities, Dalit communities, indigenous communities in South and Southeast Asia region. And there are several great organizations that are doing this work. There is a new organization that's coming up in Nepal called Just Futures Pahal, that's looking at narratives around caste and gender oppression and caste-based oppression that connects to gender, and making sure that the way that they call Just Futures Pahal names it is we tell our own stories. And it's of course focusing on lived experiences of Dalit women, especially Madhesi Dalit women in Nepal, but it's also saying that it's our lived experiences, it's our work, it's our movements, is what you need to know, and we will tell those stories from our viewpoint. We will no longer have our stories only told by others, and that we can have the narratives, our poetry, our songs, our words can tell our own stories in the way that we tell them. So it's a really exciting new organization that we're supporting, and I think SARIM should also check them out and have a podcast with them, perhaps. But that's one. It's important because a lot of work, especially in funding world, in philanthropy, is not funded when it comes to work that's led by Dalit communities, especially Dalit women. So it's important to highlight and support and hold up their work that is happening in so many deep ways across the region.
That's so inspiring, Prachi. I look forward to engaging with them. Let's talk about your writings. It also amplifies the voices of marginalized communities. You have written some fire pieces in Al Jazeera and The Guardian about caste, racism, and of course, language justice. What's it like pouring your heart into words to shift how people think? And is there, I mean, one article you wrote that you feel every South Asian should read to understand these struggles?
Oh, you can tell me which article people should read, but yeah, I mean, I think I just have found that, especially when it comes to working in the diaspora, a lot of people don't know enough about caste. The understanding about what the caste system is confused, and given that it's becoming a global issue more and more, and it's connected to understanding how Hindu supremacy also works, it's important to explain and bring to light the stories of people and the stories of movements. And that's what I try to do in my writing, is to not just have it be theoretical or only kind of academic, but it's also it's rooted in the practice of the work and rooted in the practice of movements. And that's what I try to do in my writing. One of the pieces that I feel like I hear that's useful to a lot of people is the one that I wrote about yoga, ghosts of yoga, past and present, which was trying to kind of demystify this idea that comes from the US that, yoga belongs to Hinduism, or yoga comes from Hinduism, and that, white people, quote unquote, should not, it's saying namaste, should not be appropriating yoga. But I think it's important, and the reason I wanted to write that is that we need to complicate that picture of, it's not what does appropriation mean when so many of our practices in South Asia, when it comes to our spiritual practices, especially those of oppressed caste communities, cultural practices, the languages, and all of those have been appropriated by dominant castes and Brahmins to call it as Hinduism, call it their own. So what does it mean when you say yoga is Hindus and that is being appropriated by somebody else? So through the conversation about yoga, I tried to kind of bring into the conversation what the idea of appropriation and the idea of the caste system. So I think that's one piece that has been helpful, I think, for people.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. I believe that your words are so powerful, especially on the language justice. I mean, let's dive deeper into it. Language justice is such a deep concept you have championed. I mean, this is the right to express yourself in your own language. For South Asian audience, where language can be tied to the caste and identity, how can we make our commitment more inclusive through this lens?
Yeah, and I completely agree that it's connected to identity and caste. The language question: who can speak what kind of language? Who can speak English well? How you even speak the language that you're kind of part of the state, or it's in South Asia, especially languages in India, languages are based on the state. But even in Maharashtra, for example, the rural language is different than the urban language. The way that people, I think you know that in Pakistan is probably the same, right? That the way that rural communities speak in my state, Marathi, is very different than the way that people speak in Bombay or Pune and other parts, right? And even within that, the way that oppressed caste and Dalit communities and Adivasi communities speak Marathi is very different. The roots are different. The way that the people speak is different, based on the language, based on the class. I think there's this famous example about Namdev Desal, who's is a very important Dalit poet who wrote amazing, searing poetry that was often thought of as vulgar, but he came and he wrote that poetry and went straight to people's hearts about the struggles of Dalit communities, especially Dalit communities in urban areas. And the example that I always remember is that another poet wanted to translate his work into English, and he couldn't understand his poetry, and that was still Marathi. Right, and so the poet, who was more coming from a Brahmin caste, he had to get that translated from Namdev Desal, because Namdev Desal was writing a poetry that came from his own experiences and from his community and his Dalit community, that the language that belonged to that community and that their exploitation and their histories and their livelihoods.
I mean, if that is given, that it is going to be a game changer for the inclusion. I mean, I have gone through some of your articles and found that you are studying how Dalit women are creating digital archives, claiming mobility, telling their stories online. I mean, what breakthroughs are you seeing, and how does the internet amplify voices, and what vulnerabilities come with it? How can allies show up in digital Dalit feminist struggles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's specifically about that. In general, as you know, the kind of Dalit History Month as even a concept and as a practice or new thing that was started by Dalit women who were based in the U.S. and in India, both Sangapali Aruna, Christina Danuja, and Tenmuri Sundarajan, who started that, and that's really a kind of a almost like in both in a physical activist space, but also digital activism, where I would say Tenmuri Sundarajan is a big part of that. That creating that digital activism, really talking about what is it mentioning, what does Wikipedia talk about when they talk about caste? What is knowledge exists in these spaces, in online spaces, and there are other examples of organizations that are doing that's looking at how our online space is talking about the work of Dalit communities, the work of Dalit women's activism, and that kind of movement that is led by many people, not just the three that I mentioned. Many women and activists in across South Asia is very important to uplift and popularize, and it's already there, and it's important to amplify their voices and amplify multiple voices. Right, that we know that the work, the fact that it exists, it means there are many, and not just a handful of people, but hundreds of women that are doing that work in different ways, some whose names we know that are known, some whose we don't, and that this work is can only be by the leaderful movement, right? The leaderful movement of Dalit women across the diasporas and across the region as well. So it's important for us to think about that and popularize that.
I find it, I mean, quite powerful. Dalit women are reclaiming their narratives online. And, also, you have been really bold calling on philanthropies to decriminalize, not just to decolonize their work. For people building small foundations or giving personally, what are practical first is steps, or how do we avoid tokenism and build governance that centers Dalit and Adivasi leadership genuinely?
Yeah, I mean, it's a ongoing practice, and it's never something that we can. There are many steps, there are many tools, there are many practices that include kind of collective care and wisdom of many people together, and it's important, like I said, knowing that. These movements are leaderful movements, and for philanthropy or many people to acknowledge that when one is talking about debrahminizing anything, debrahminizing history, or debrahminizing the current movements, or debrahminizing philanthropy, we need to know that all of that work, all of the collective work, is done by many people in the history. There are many leaders, especially the late women and Adivasi women, whose work has been not noticed, has been not named. It's important as part of the Dalit History Month. They have done the work to popularize people who we don't know about, where people don't know about, because a lot of times you see, who are in South Asia's famous writers, and the people who get talked about, or women who get talked about within those, are also always particular kind of upper caste and dominant caste people, who are South Asia's leading movement leaders. It's always a certain kind of people. Even Ambedkar gets talked about only as a Dalit leader, but not as a labor leader, not as an economist, not as somebody who was a political leader. Even Jyotiba Phule gets talked about only in a particular way, who founded the women's school, but he talked about land issues, he talked about water rights. He talked about a way to make and remake society that is not just about caste but capitalism, etc. And we need to see our leaders as fuller intellectuals and fuller academics and intellectuals and movement leaders that are contributing to much more than caste equity issues, but also around caste equity, right? So it has to be both. So philanthropy also needs to do that work. We talked about making sure that language justice is practiced, so that you're not only supporting people who know how to speak English and English in a particular way, so that it's easy for people in philanthropy to go to them and fund them, to do the work of going to rural areas, going to organizations that are led by communities that may or may not be registered in the same way. And really finding those, and even when you are supporting organizations that may not be led by the Latin oppressed caste communities, what does the decision making look like? Is your approach to your work looking into anti-caste approach, the way that you're doing decision making? What does that look like? Are that's what debrahminizing really means, right? They're looking at the intersections of land and labor and patriarchy and all of these issues as caste issues and as caste issues as all those other issues as well. So that is what philanthropy and other folks who are doing that work, whether it's in academia or funding world, need to look at. And so that's when you don't end up tokenizing. You end up tokenizing if you're only doing representational politics. When you say, I'm going to only check the box and say, here are 4 or 5 Dalit groups, that Dalit-led or indigenous-led groups that I'm supporting, I'm done. That's a different approach than saying, I'm funding organizations that are having that anti-caste approach, having this approach to all of their work. And within that, it's important also to support the leadership of those that are coming from the marginalized communities. That's a different way of looking at it.
Those steps are, so actionable. True Ambedkar is spirit. Prachi, let's end on a high note in a dream big like Ambedkar did. Picturing a South Asia where caste is gone and marginalized communities are thriving. What does that look like to you? And what's one step our listeners can take today to channel Ambedkar's vision to make it real?
Mm. Well, I think one of the big steps is reading Annihilation of Caste and studying it and understanding its importance in the context today, right? Because Dr. Ambedkar wrote Annihilation of Caste in the 1930s. Situation now and what South Asia looks like, what India and any of these countries look like is different. What anti-caste visions look like in the context of Hindu-dominated countries versus Muslim-dominated countries, that's going to look different. So it's also contextual and regional and geographical. And in the U.S., it's going to look different, right? But if you understand the theory of what caste system is, it came from, and why it needs to be annihilated. If you understand that from Ambedkar's dream and his writing and his analysis, and then actually put it into practice based on what you're fighting for and connect it to all the different issues, then I think you can do that work. So that's one actionable step is really understanding what the caste system is and how it can function, the functions today.
Wow, what a powerful conversation with you, Prachi. Your words were masterclass in the clarity and companion and the conviction. From Ambedkar to archives, from language, justice to lived resistance. You reminded us why our struggles must be intersectional and our visions international. You have not just given us the insights, but the fire and a roadway for what solidarity can look like when it's done right. As you said, I would like to end with that quote that change does not start at the top, but it starts within and decision making with the right decision making. So, with that, until next time, this is Heman Das signing off from Courageous Conversation. Keep listening, keep dreaming, and remember, breaking silence is just a form of resistance. Once again, thank you very much, Prachi Patankar, for being a part of this beautiful and insightful conversation. It is really a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jai Bhim, Jai Savitri.
Jai Bhim.